Welcome to Unlearn, where we talk to industry leaders about unlearning how we go to market.
I'm Kelly Sarabin, and I run Tech Partner Enablement and Advocacy at HubSpot.
And I'm Asher Matthew, co-founder of Partnership Leaders.
The old ways of going to market are getting more expensive and less effective.
To thrive in an era of digital transformation, you have to go to market differently. Let's find out how. Hey everybody, we're back with another episode of Unlearn. I still haven't been able to convince Kelly to kick these podcasts off, so I'm still working on that. So hopefully one day we'll actually get there.
That's because you have the radio voice, so you have to kick it off.
Ladies and gentlemen, another Unlearn podcast. No, we got it. This is going to be a fun one because of the guests that we have. And Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Do you want to just give us a little bit of intro to who you are and a little bit of how you got to where you are, and then we'll kick the podcast off?
Sure thing. So first, happy to be here. And I always love sharing stories and a little bit of my career history. So my name is Jeff Barr. I am VP and Chief Evangelist for the Amazon Web Services. I've been working for Amazon for a little over 20 years, and I started my career really deeply in tech, but very quickly found out that what I was really good at was first diving deep into some kind of tech, some kind of complex system, understanding it, and then explaining it. And then over the years, the balance of how much of my tech side versus my communication marketing side has shifted more toward the communication and marketing. I still love and enjoy tech. I don't get to build it. I get more to understand and appreciate it.
Super. So Jeff, what's top of mind for you? We always start with this question because Kelly and I have tons of questions, but we always start with what's top of mind for you? And then we kind of break into the podcast.
So top of mind for me is actually always simplicity. It's so easy to write complex, hard to understand explanations. And I think some content creators almost relish this idea of, let me make something so elaborate, so complex that no one can fully understand it. And almost you have to be a wizard just to get it. I'm always striving for, I want to explain things in a clean, clear, understandable way without making it seem as if I'm talking down to the audience. And there's just a very delicate balance there where you're using just the right level of sophistication to get the point across without using way too many words or words that they have to look up. I do have a global audience for the content I create, and very aware that I have an audience where English is not necessarily their first language. So I always try to think of my audience and my customers when I'm creating content.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Jargon in particular in the tech industry, but also when you look at kind of consulting analyst space where you can get a lot of good ideas, but it's also often laden with jargon. And so people really have to go Google search and they just quite frankly don't bother to understand what is being said, right? Because it takes a lot of work to translate. But that's hard, right? Distilling complexity into simplicity is a talent, right? It's a very hard thing to do. So I think why a lot of content doesn't do it, it actually takes more work, right? If you want to write a tagline for something, those 3 or 4 words may take months versus writing an article, that has 800 words to explain what you do, maybe be the easier task.
Exactly. It's those short, very fundamental pieces of content that they're so important and so difficult. When I'm writing a blog post, because a lot of the earliest content I wrote before computers and word processing was a thing, was often actually on a typewriter. I wanted to get things right. And I tend to write in a linear fashion. And I find that getting a title correct for a blog post is one of the most difficult things. I think if you could look at any of my posts and if you could see my character by character, word by word edits, you'll probably see that a lot of the posts have 3, 4, 5 titles that I will very quickly iterate on, kind of run them by my audience in my head. And I will not actually proceed past the title until I'm happy with it. And as far as I'm concerned, it's final at that point. So it is that simplicity. And I do think that people that don't design or create as part of their job or their hobbies, they often think that you start with nothing, and then the first step up from nothing is the simple thing. But that's usually not the case. Usually you start from nothing, you create this very elaborate solution to something, and then you need to then whittle that back down to to what are the essentials. It's sometimes I think you don't fully understand the problem you're solving until you've built that elaborate solution. And then you get that bit of insight and say, okay, now that I see I've made the hard, complicated one, I can make the simple, much more easy to understand one.
Right. This is going to be an amazing podcast, because like this is what I've learned, right? I went on to create the Sunny Side Up podcast, which basically was a project to start the demand gen efforts for this company called Demand Matrix. But selfishly, I just wanted to bring all the people onto the podcast that were really amazing creatives and that were really amazing content, but just folks that were like marketing leaders, right? And it's on that podcast I learned about like Bill Bernblack and like all the amazing like thought leaders, or action leaders I would call them, that actually brought the creator movement, as we call it, to life. And this creator movement, I feel like, has been kind of like compounding over years, and it's kind of got to the point where like a lot of executives used to outsource their LinkedIn posts or blog posts or just their external comms, and they've actually started to like do it themselves. And you can kind of tell, not kind of, but you can actually really tell like who is doing it themselves and who isn't doing it themselves, because like this, when they speak from within them, they actually like, it looks like they've launched a mini product in the market.
Have to agree. Like the authenticity is so important, and being yourself, for bringing your personality, your background, your experiences, maybe bring in other aspects of your life that are not just about your job, and saying, hey, I'm a whole person, and I have other things that I do and that I'm interested in that affect me besides just my job. I really think it helps the audience to relate to you. Yeah. And there's earlier in my career, I think all the professionals looked so slick and so polished, and you think, okay, everything is going exactly right for all those people, and nothing's a challenge, and they're all perfect. And then you get into one of those roles, and everybody then treats you like that. But the reality is, we're all just learning and growing, and hopefully adapting and changing as well. I have this personal thing about never getting stuck in a rut and never getting really fixated on any particular technology or iteration of technology. And that's helped me to stay fresh and hopefully young, versus I met a lot of people early in my career that would just get stuck on one thing and say, this is the thing that's going to keep me going for the next decade or two. I don't subscribe to that at all. I'd much rather be on the leading edge and always trying something new. Maybe it's not fully formed. Maybe it's not quite there, but I'd rather be there than just stuck a generation or two behind.
That's great. I think.
And who is your audience? Because I feel like you probably have a fairly large audience. You said it was international, but what about the persona? Like, are we having business people read it? Is it more just technical people? Who are you reaching?
Sure. So even before we get to that point, we should explain that my main piece of content I create is called the AWS News Blog, which I started writing in late 2004. So we're coming up on the 19-year mark for that. And I launched this blog when we were first getting started at Amazon with our infrastructure web services. And at that point, I was the only person really doing any kind of marketing activities and developer outreach. And I wanted to reach a wider audience. And I always really thought of my audience as simply really builders. And a builder might be a hands-on developer. It could be an architect who's maybe creating plans and diagrams and abstractions for others to use. It might be CTOs that are trying to understand and evaluate a technology. Those are the folks I think of as being in my audience. But this starts all the way at the student level. It's actually quite fascinating sometimes, where I'll be on a campus, I'll be meeting with some students, and they'll tell me how they were just learning about the cloud and learning about AWS, and they did some searches and they happened upon my content and they found it useful. And it's very gratifying to be able to create this body of content over the years. And of all the rewards you get, hearing that it helped somebody on their journey, that it helped them to learn something new, it helped them to accomplish something, it helped them to grow in their career, maybe make their life a little bit better for them and for their family. That's what I find just really gratifying about what I do.
That's amazing. And so, okay, sorry, did you say you started this in 2004?
That's right. It was it was November 2004 where I put my first two posts online and basically saying, hey, here we are. And for about the first 10 years, I was the sole author and we didn't really have a team around me. And then as our launch schedule accelerated and as we built the audience, we slowly put a team together. And it was those early days, we had no editorial calendar. We didn't have a process. It was simply literally my colleague was just emailing me or catching me in the hallway and saying, hey, Jeff, we're about to launch this really cool thing. It would be great for you to write a blog post. So I managed everything pretty much manually through my inbox. And that worked until it didn't. And then we started hiring a team and have an actual systematized process where the teams get to create tickets. And we now have multiple bloggers that we basically all discuss and agree who's going to write. We have a draft process, a review process, but for the first 10 years or so, it was just me and my inbox and my blogging tools.
Wow, that's amazing.
And what were your goals with the blog, both now and back in the day when it was just you? In terms of, were you trying to drive awareness? Were you trying to attract new developers to work on AWS? How did you conceive of it when you started it?
So that's a great question. And before I launched the blog, I had been doing an awful lot of travel. And my family was very young at the time, and they were very understanding of the fact that I was traveling a lot. And I was really thinking about how do I scale my effort? And beyond simply how many events can I accept invitations to and how many places can I be in the course of a trip? So the thinking was, we're doing some amazing things at AWS. How do I get this out to developers all over the world? And I really thought of it in terms of my colleagues are building all these really cool services. I think they're cool. They think they're cool. They were designed to meet the needs of the audience. And I want my audience to simply understand and appreciate what these things are. And then hopefully say, that sounds so amazing. It solves a problem that I have. I'm now empowered to do something with this.
I'm still stuck on you've been doing this for 20 years,
I never would have thought.
I don't think I've actually met anybody that's been blogging for 20 years consistently and been able to build this thing. Okay, this is great.
One of the lessons for me is it can take a long time in your life and in the arc of your career to find the thing that you are really good at, that maybe you can be the best in the world. And I'm not saying I'm the best in the world at that, but I've found my niche, and that niche. I was 40 something when I launched this blog, and usually people have kind of found their role by then. But I'm not saying that I didn't have any actual gigantic crises or failures, but I was doing things that in retrospect, they were all leading up to being able to do this, but I'm better at doing what I'm doing now than I was at doing any of those other things. And keeping yourself a little bit open, a little bit flexible, and then sometimes you're doing one thing and this opportunity presents itself that's a bit of a fork in the road. And I tend to almost always say the universe has basically engineered you to get to the point where that fork is the right thing for you to do. And sometimes others can maybe see something in you, that your skills, your attitude, whatever you've got, and say, I know this is the thing you're doing right now, but have you ever considered this other thing? And quite often that's because others can see things in you that maybe you're so stuck on your own view of yourself that you can't quite see. So almost always take that fork in the road.
That's great life advice.
This is amazing.
So how has it evolved in terms of now that you have a team, right? Has it become more structured and sort of part of a larger orchestrated strategy across developer relations?
It has a little bit. We still try to be informal in the sense that we don't get too corporate, and we don't have an approved list of vocabulary. And one thing that I have a little alarm kind of in the back of my head, or almost like this little mini Jeff watching over what I write. And when we get to that that jargon point, when it's just kind of a bunch of buzzwords strung together, there's times when I'll start with some of our internal descriptions, and it's sometimes it's a little bit too buzzword laden, and you type it, and then little mini Jeff says, you know what, that's just a bunch of BS. That's not actually helping the customers. Like, you can, if you can't satisfy yourself that you're communicating at high quality, you're never going to satisfy anybody else. So you need to be you need to be a critic of yourself, but you need to also be understanding and say, well, you're actually doing something pretty good here.
Just for everybody's info, Jeff has almost 75,000 followers on LinkedIn, just so that people understand the context of what we're talking about here. Jeff, so I feel like what you've been able to do is go from content creator to content operator. Would that be a good way to explain your journey?
I'm not quite sure what the difference is. Maybe the creator, we make that initial content, but the operator really says, I think, how do you get continued value out of it? And so I do think that being adept with social media is part of being successful here. And that's something I still think that I'm learning to be awesome at, because there's so many different platforms, and you can spread yourself way too thin and try to have a footprint on every last one of them. But being everywhere is actually really hard, because you need to understand your audience, which is different from platform to platform. You need to be able to not just be there, and you can't do hit and run posting, right? You can't just post something there and not pay attention to replies or comments or feedback.
Yeah, and then there's no engagement and stuff.
Platforms have a personality. And unless you understand it, you can't be on all of them.
And what I mean by content operator is like it was just you, and then you said, well, how do I scale myself? But as I scale myself, how do I actually scale content for my company as well? And so I'd love to just unpack a little bit of like, well, how is your team organized, and like, how do they think about content every day? And like, what type of support system do you have around you? Because, there's a lot of like, let's call it contentpreneurs out there, I would say. And they listen to all the people that are also trying to figure this out. And there are some people that have actually systems for publishing and producing. And there's an end in mind where like, they're like, do this, and then here's a destination, right? Not all content today that's available on social media has some sort of a destination. A lot of it is but a lot of it is actually debate. So I'd love to understand like the resourcing that you have behind you to allow you to be able to write content and engage your audience, because like AWS has like, I don't know how many, like thousands of products now that you can offer.
We're at the multiple hundreds of services. I think the latest number is 329 services. But to that, you have to add the fact that we launch these individual services, and then we do thousands of additional feature additions to each service.
And then people build on top of that, and like the circle goes on over and over again, right? And so you're like, and I love how this podcast started, because your job, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is to simplify so people understand, and then they can take their current problem, match it to the service, find a solution, and get going to the next problem. Would that be correct?
That's right. And one of the fun challenges, and so we have a set of leadership principles at Amazon that are available publicly. People can search and find them. And one of the things that I did as we were scaling up from just me to a whole team of bloggers. So right now we have, I think, 8 bloggers located all around the world. And some like me, we started with writing in English. Others, English is their second or third language. But we all work together, and we all bring our unique backgrounds to the team. We have one blog manager, and she's in charge of basically helping our internal constituency. All the teams that are launching services, they work with her to create a ticket for the new launch. And so they basically say, here's a launch that's upcoming. Here's the launch date. Here's the internal documentation. Here's a very important Amazon document called the PRFAQ, which is short for press release. Press plus frequently asked questions.
Very familiar with that concept.
Right. So we have that. We have access to the service, and so these teams are continuously creating tickets. We don't actually write a post for every ticket. We have some discretion within the team to decide what do we think the audience needs at any given point. And then as we're writing the posts, we are always actually thinking of the customer. We always get to use the service hands-on. I always tell the teams, I love you. You're all awesome. I don't believe a word you say. So I have to actually use all these services firsthand.
That is such a cool
to get that
philosophy to live by. Yes.
Of saying, you have to have authenticity of saying, you can't say, this is how they told me it works. It has to say, I personally used it, and this is what I witnessed, and this is what I saw. And so we always go for that hands-on. So during the writing process, what I did is, as we were scaling up, I took all of the Amazon leadership principles. I kept all of the titles intact, and then I rewrote the definition of each one to be very specific to how we think as a blogger. The favorite one is frugality, which is our second leadership principle. And in a lot of situations, you think of frugality as money or resources. But within the blog team, we think of frugality as being very respectful of the time of our audience. Yep. So with a very large reader base, every extra word that we put in multiplies out to a lot of wasted time. So I always tell our bloggers, we want to be concise but detailed. We're going to choose our words with care. And we don't want to overwhelm the audience with too much content. It's very easy to say, well, I must have at least 1,000 words or 2,000 words, and try to strive for as much as possible. We actually try to keep things kind of tight when we're getting ready for a big event. Like every year we run this event in Vegas called reInvent. As we're planning, we will set ourselves up a word budget, and we'll say, regardless of how awesome and rich this particular service is, we're going to give it, let's say, 750 words. And within that 700, and we don't strictly hold ourselves to it, but we use that to set expectations with the various teams that are building. Because you could easily take any of these services and write thousands of words, and you could write a part 1, part 2, part 3. We say, yeah, we know how to do that, but that's not how we choose to actually work. We're going to really respect our audience time. We're going to keep these posts to 750 words and maybe 5 screenshots. We'd rather have them finish the post in one setting versus leaving it on a browser tab where they'll probably never, ever get to it again.
That's amazing. And sorry, if this question is too forward, let me know. But how many people are there in your org that support all this content evangelism that's kind of put in that bucket?
So we generally don't give out different internal team sizes, but you could look at the blog and you could count the number of different bloggers. And right now, I think there are 8 of us. We tend, so I'm really full-time charged with content creation. Okay. My other colleagues have other duties in addition to writing blog posts.
That's what I was kind of trying to get to, because it sounds like you're the product manager of the content, right? And then there's a process that's running, and then you have contributors. And do you also engage with external contributors, like people that are not Amazon employees?
We currently do not, and I think there's a lot of great other content creators out there. But one of the things you think about when you're in a popular situation is, how do you scale the effort? And there's a lot of things that I could do that I realize that it's an open the floodgate situation, where the first time we had a blog post from an external party that we would accept onto the news blog, we would get hundreds of other requests that say, oh, that looks great. I would like to be there as well. Yeah. And maybe it sounds a little bit weird, but having to tell people no too often is really painful. I like to see people succeed, and I like to be able to say yes, and having to say, no, I can't, I'm sorry, we can't. After you do that enough times, it's this is actually not enjoyable. And so we don't even take submissions from inside the team unless you're or inside the company, unless you're officially part of the news blog team. And this goes to the point of again, scale, and also that authenticity, where sometimes we'll get very busy and we'll get that back to the team, and they'll say, okay, and with the best of intent, they'll say, okay, Jeff, well, you don't have to write it yourself, but we'll ghostwrite it for you and you can put your name on it. And we just don't do that. We fully believe in giving credit where credit is due. And we're never going to, we wouldn't allow ghostwriting because it's not authentic. And if someone else wrote the content, I would want them to get the credit for having done so.
Yeah, I went through a phase personally where I got caught into like, let me post every single day, every single hour, right? And then I realized this is all crap. Even I wouldn't read it. And so now what I've done is, because my interest, and this is a great, I would say this is somewhat a podcast masterclass in content in a way, right? Like my interests are to work with other executives that are in partnerships and help elevate them, right? And I've just found that the best time to engage people like that is either after 4 p.m., right? Or on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings. So I tested all of this content times, and I realized that if I only do one extremely high quality post, which is very natural to the current conversations that are happening in the market, that allows me to engage and grasp and get a feel for like, where are people at and what do I need to do to build them. So my process is I'll have 100, let's say 50 conversations in a week, right? Or let's say 25, like, right? And
Asher basically doesn't work. He just,
I know exactly. I'm like, wait, I'm pretty careful of what I'm saying over here, because I'm like, okay, people will be like, well, this guy just talks all the time, right? But there are some days where I will have like 10 meetings a day, especially as we get closer to Catalyst, our event. But I'll take the most interesting conversation that I had and really think about like, where do I stand on it based on my values, and just post about that. And what I found is that over time, like the audience that I really care about and I'm passionate about helping also start tuning into the time, and they look forward to it. And then I engage with them, and then we workshop things across, and then I take what I've learned, and then I go take it back to my team and share with them so we can build features or products or whatever else we want to do about that. But this like limited but very high quality content, I is actually I believe it's the right way to go. And kudos to Kelly, because she and I had a debate about like just content quality over quantity last year, and just like most things, Kelly won. And so I said, okay, well, let's try this out, and it served me well.
I like that idea as well, and I remember in days past, my colleagues would come to me and they would always say, where's your content calendar, and do you make sure that you always post on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, and do you have a time? And I really don't. If I have nothing to say, then
just don't say it.
The world isn't going to miss me. Yeah. A day might go by and I won't say anything. And when I do have something to say, I think there's a little bit more respect for the fact that, oh, well, you didn't just try to fill up the pipeline and keep your output just full. Just when there's nothing to say, well, just be quiet and let others have their turn. I have nothing wrong with that. And I'd much rather post a little bit less than necessary than too much, and have people start to tune you out and say, well, because it's kind of obvious when people do fillers, when they do best ofs and repeats and kind of low quality, not thoughtful content.
Right.
I always I have to impress myself with whatever I do and say, would I find this useful? Is this helpful? Yeah. Maybe it's a bit entertaining, but if it's just like, it's just okay. And for one good example, for a while I used to write April Fool's posts, and I had a lot of fun putting those together. And I actually would write them, and as I'm putting them together, I'm actually enjoying the level of humor that I would put into them. At a certain point, I maybe just I couldn't impress myself anymore with what I was putting together for those posts, so I just stopped doing them. And I had to be my own my own quality control and say, well, if I don't like it, then no one else will either. And I think you have to apply that to pretty much everything you do.
Do you hang out with other, let's call it, people that are like you at your level in the Seattle area? I want to take a name. It's somewhat at your competitor's company, but like I just wanted to see if it naturally comes up and if it's okay to share.
Sure. I don't get to hang out with a whole lot of folks. I mostly work from home and connect online with people, but sure. Let me know who you're thinking of.
I'm thinking about Steve Clayton. Do you know Steve Clayton by any chance?
I actually don't, but if he's here, I'd love to meet him sometime.
Okay. Steve Clayton is the chief storyteller of Microsoft, and it's amazing. His background is very similar to yours, right? Almost 10 years ago or 15 years ago is when I met him, and that was the first time that he actually, like, I learned about, like, hey, how do you put a story together? And it was at a time where Microsoft was like very like producty and there was like no stories, but like the work that Steve did is like go and sit with engineering teams and go sit with product teams and really unlock like what the story actually is. I think you would really enjoy meeting him.
Okay.
That's interesting, though, Asher. It sounds, the way you're describing it, his role, though, sounds more like branding, which obviously would relate to what Jeff does, but is different. Is that correct? Is his role more to come up with these core brand stories?
Well, I mean, maybe that's the right term.
Or you don't know.
But his work always like brings the humanity in what's happening. And it's like,
I think the important part here is there are people inside of all of this. And if it's only bits and bytes and speeds and feeds, it can get really boring and really dry really fast. It has to be about people and how it affects them and what they can do with it. And then it has to be beyond like the press release quotes.
Yeah.
If you look at all of my posts, you'll see that I almost never use those standard quotes in a press release.
The
new Amazon blah 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 is really amazing, and we sure hope that we'll use it sometime. And then it's like, you know, says so and so from big important company. I never ever use those because I don't think they add any value for the readers, and they're so flat and so predictable. We just have almost a policy.
People tune them out.
They totally do. I'd much rather have an in-depth post. If someone at one of those companies uses a service and figures out a cool way to do it, or they built something awesome with it, I'd much rather have them write a post on their company's tech blog, and then I'd be happy to link to something like that. You know, if whatever company, you know, company XYZ looked at this new feature and here's what they've built and here's what they actually have learned from doing it, that's far more interesting than just one of these just kind of bland endorsement.
Yeah, I remember doing a podcast with somebody, again, just very similar to you, who was at SAP. I almost feel like you guys all need to do a retreat together. You know, I just think that and you guys could come up with your own podcast and do your own summit together. You know, I think that would be pretty cool. But I'll make the intros after this call. I think you would really enjoy being here because there were like, every one of you was all about like, hey, how do I take this, tell it very simply, succinctly, beautifully, like the whole thing is packaged together so that it's an amazing experience for the reader. And yes, you know, there are some people that don't like pictures and there's some people that like pictures, but like all three of you are very conscious of like, how do I do this, but how do I do it at scale so that multiple audiences that live in multiple geographies all can consume it. Now, is your blog translated? I'm assuming it is translated in different languages. I'm curious how many languages you translated it today.
So we do some internal translation, and some of it's done, I think, by semi-automated means with review, and others is done manually. I actually just came back from Istanbul, Turkey a few days ago, and one of my colleagues there, one of the many things she takes the English language posts on the news blog and then translates those into Turkish for us. And I actually didn't know that was one of her duties, but was great to hear that. And that was really great to hear, and good to hear that we have a good audience in Turkish. It's interesting though, when you talk to developers around the world, you always want to meet people where they're at. And to me, that localized content is part of doing that, making that effort to give them what they need in the language that they're most comfortable with. On the other hand, it seems like English is almost the universal global language of developers. And sometimes I'll hear them say, well, I read a lot in English to help me develop my English reading and speaking skills. So we really give them both options.
So just speaking of the scale component, what visibility do you have in terms of the end-to-end reader journey, right? So I think with developer relations in general, but also with content, it's often hard, right, to see what happens and what the impact is of the content. So we can track views of our content, and we know that people are reading it, and obviously that's a good sign. But ultimately, content has a particular purpose, right? So it's another thing to say, hey, did people take this content and use it? And of course, if your call to action is embedded in the content, it may be easier to track. But I think in your case, and usually with developer content, It's not so easy necessarily, right, to track the journey from a technology perspective, but I'd be curious how you guys look at that and how you try to see what happens next from the reader, right? Like where do they go now that they've read this content?
Wow. So this is, I think, one of the trickiest topics. We certainly watch metrics internally, and we know what posts and what kind of posts do best. And we try to understand a little bit about that. And posts for certain kinds of launches tend to do better than for others. We do track all the standard things, the bounce rates, and we do try to include a call to action on the page. But we don't get overly scientific about it, because developers see through any kind of overt marketing very, very quickly. And as soon as developers think that they're being marketed to in uppercase, they say, oh my gosh, they are trying to trick me into doing something. So you have to be very respectful about that. And yes, there'll be a call to action at the bottom of the post, most likely. And we certainly hope that they do that. I tend to actually not look at any metrics whatsoever, which makes me an absolute pariah among my Amazon colleagues, where everything we do should be informed by data. And the reason I don't look at metrics is I'm not sure what I could do differently if some post gets me 100,000 views, another one gets me 200,000. That's awesome, but there's an element of chance to how these posts get picked up online, and it's not always directly related to what's in the post or what we do. And trying to reverse engineer that is kind of maddening. And to think, well, I need to write this by all the right rules to make it a bestseller. It's hard to know. Sometimes the posts that you write that are for a brand new, really awesome, super cool service, they do just fine. But then you write another post that's kind of a medium-sized feature, but it might be what I think of as a puzzle piece feature, where we've got a couple different aspects of the product line. This new feature brings them all together in some way. Those can be overwhelmingly popular, and you don't even know that they're going to be until the audience looks and says, wow, that now solves that final piece that now lets me do a really good solution. You don't always know that ahead of time. So you have to just leave yourself some flexibility to see what's going to work and what's not going to work, and not be too much of a slave to the metrics.
I'm just going to ask, did your top post do over 1 million views or impressions?
I don't actually share the numbers externally, so I don't think I can say that.
Okay, that's okay.
But we do really well.
Okay, yeah.
We do really well. Now the funny thing is, so when you publish web services online, right? They all have a lifetime. You launch them. Yeah. They grow for a while. Most of the time, they're gonna last into the indefinite future. Yeah. But every so often, we need to either deprecate an entire service or sometimes just some feature of a service. Yeah. When we do either of those, we do it with a lot of planning, with a very long time horizon, with a lot of care to help customers migrate to what would be the better solution. Yeah. So I've seen several times that the posts that I write that say, basically, dear reader, we know you've enjoyed this feature. Sorry to tell you, it's actually going to be going away at some point. Here's how to figure out if you're using it, and here's how to move forward. Yeah. Those posts that are effectively negative posts tend to actually do really well. So the ones that take away from the audience sometimes do just as well as the ones that come from.
This is great. I do. So I have met, I think, of all the people, because again, I became a very big nerd about this whole content journey, because I just figured out I'm like, this is so cool. Like, if you can explain things so simply, and I know the person, and I always keep a tab of well, who's got who's done a post that went into X hundreds of thousands of. So then I know one person, and the number one post that they did got 800K impressions. I was like, wow, that is amazing. And I shared that on the podcast is because people don't realize the reach of LinkedIn, and so it can be very, very
but let's just pause there and acknowledge very clearly that the number of impressions or views is not usually the best metric to talk about impact, right?
100%.
So like there's probably usually on LinkedIn, if you post like some personal story or a crisis, it's gonna probably go viral, especially if it's like an attractive woman in the post will help. But that doesn't mean that it's gonna have lasting impact, where Jeff could post something really cool and innovative,
and people just keep
and it
going back
strikes
to
a
it over
chord
and
with
over again.
people. And then they go do it, right? They go use the service. It like transforms their product. Like that's why I was talking about impact. I think views is one sort of indicator of impact, but it's definitely not. And I think chasing after views is a
I'm definitely not advocating people should chase after views. What I'm saying is like understand the magnitude of what you're dealing with, because I don't know, like there's, again, you have all these entrepreneurs, right? They're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go do this, blah 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 blah, like, you know. And then they're like, oh, I got 50 likes, fantastic, right? And like, well, there's a much larger audience that you need to really dive into and understand the needs of, and like it takes time, and you still have to get there. But for record keeping sake, I was like, oh, okay, well, who's got this? And like, what does that actually feel like and mean like, and how broad can it get there, right? So that's the only reason why I shared this. But
I actually like to rely on, and maybe this sounds a little bit weird, but I like more anecdotes and stories. So when we have any kind of an event that I go to, I'm much more excited by just hearing from people that say, hi, Jeff, you know, I read your post about this and it really helped me and I used it to further my career and my life. I just like those little bits of recognition that say I made a difference in somebody's life. And the interesting thing about living here in Seattle is that we have a pretty big tech population, but the city's kind of small. And so if my wife and I go like walk down from the hill, go down to have dinner, and we're like out in the city, quite often someone will just come up and say, hey, I recognize you from your blogs, and I love what you've done, and this is really cool. And it's just a really touching human moment to really hear from an individual, that one individual, to hear someone say, you know, I listened to what you wrote and I applied what you told me, and I've now stepped up in my life. I've got a certification. I've got a new job. That's far more interesting and heartwarming than 10,000 page views or something, because it actually meant that I changed somebody's life in some little way. Or I told them how to change their life.
The compounding of that over the 20 years that you've been doing this is fantastic. It's just amazing to see that like you found your calling, you stuck to it, and you did it for a very long time, and you're still enjoying it. Like you're talking about this stuff, like you maybe just started, and we can like the enthusiasm around it is coming through clearly. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, liking what you do is so important. Like actually enjoying your job and getting up fresh and every day and saying, okay, what am I going to do with this, and like what cool thing is in my inbox that I get to write about. And I absolutely do have to acknowledge here that part of what makes this fun is that I have all these really amazing, creative colleagues that are building awesome things to meet the needs of our customers. So like all this amazing stuff lands up in my inbox of, hey, we have this and this and this. And it's this cornucopia of things to choose from. And it's this almost embarrassment of riches of, oh, I can do this or this or this. And the challenge sometimes is there's so many great opportunities to share things that you have to just pick 1 out of 10 and say, okay, this is the one I will do today.
Yeah, it's great. Now,
I'd love to circle back what you were talking about earlier in terms of sort of the spaces out there that you go into to sort of build the community, because I think, you know, for developers and developer marketers in particular, it's always a question is, where do I go? And I assume Asher was referring to your LinkedIn followers when he said 75,000.
Yeah.
I would not have thought that would be the leading forum for developers. I would think like Discord, Reddit, but I would love to hear your take as someone who's immersed in the world. Where are the communities that sort of persona is most hanging out, and that you find the most sort of productive to go into and kind of share what you're writing?
So I've actually found LinkedIn is the best place for me to disseminate what I do. And whether it's a self-contained post where I just share, hey, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm up to, or this is a piece of content that I'd like to refer you to, I'm getting far better results there than I get on Twitter, which I've stepped back a bit from. I do have a presence on Reddit, and I'm happy to connect with folks there. tried a couple of different other things. I know my colleagues are dealing with or are putting content on Instagram and TikTok, and they're having some good effect there with content that is specific to those platforms. This is why I think you can only truly be at home on a few platforms, because you need to understand the audience and kind of the dynamic of how you create and interact with the audience on each of those to be legit. Like simply copying and pasting the same thing across 8 different platforms. And there are tools that'll do that for you. I wouldn't go anywhere near any of those.
Super. Yeah, that doesn't work well. So what on LinkedIn, you find a lot of developers are on there engaging in the content. Is it also like CTOs and sort of tech partnerships people, or is it sort of working developers? There's a critical mass there that engage your content?
It's a pretty healthy mix. And one of the things I do like about that platform is that I do get information about the demographics. So I can see the mix of titles. I can see, geographically where they're coming from. And I find it helpful, but I would never look at the metrics and say, well, I'm getting more CTOs and developers, so let me change my content in some way. I think you have to be careful about getting into too tight of a feedback loop and say, well, I will not optimize this, and somehow I will up level it because I think that CTOs will just want overviews and not details. And maybe there's a good route to success there, but that's just not the way I would happen to do it.
What do you think about this whole AI and content? I wanted to wait till the podcast got a little warmer.
So we don't spend another 45 minutes on AI.
It's fascinating to see how quickly it went from, I know a lot of these things have been in development for actual decades, but it was really only the experts knew about it. And we kept thinking, well, there'll be there'll be someday when this goes really from a small scale that is great for limited kind of projects and experiments to suddenly everyone can use it and benefit from it. And it's totally fascinating how quickly that happened. That earlier this year, like we were having dinner with some friends, neither of whom are in tech, but are technically capable. And one person a program manager, the other person a high school math teacher. They're the ones that came to me and said, "Hey Jeff, are you using AI? We're both using it in our jobs." It's like, wow, this has now gotten out into the mainstream as kind of regular folks are not just knowing what it is, but figuring out how to write prompts and get value from it. So really thrilling. And we've had to think of the implications of the longer term of what's real and what's been created. I do worry about the audience's ability to distinguish the two. And the potential to fool people is very high. And that really scares me a lot. There have been some of these deep fakes that you can deep fake audio and you get this panic call from someone claiming to be a family member. Hey, I've been kidnapped and you need to do this. And the whole thing has been deep faked. That's very scary. Yeah. And even within our family, we're thinking of little like kind of personal kind of not encryption, but authentication between family members to think how can we authenticate that the person on the other end of the line is really a family member?
Yeah. So what I was thinking was, how Twitter has the blue check mark. Now they're going to have a green check mark if you actually wrote it. So somebody's going to come up and monetize the green check mark.
But what if you use AI to give you a really nice opening structure?
Yeah.
And you say, okay, this is mostly correct, and then you are effectively the
author
the editor
of it,
for what the AI has produced.
Yeah, the writer drop and it actually solves for, and then you iterate from there.
I've done some experimentation, Kelly. I've done some experimentation. I did one really fun thing where I said, imagine you're a waiter in a restaurant. Explain cloud computing in terms of menu items in your restaurant. Got some absolutely fascinating creative results out of that.
That does sound interesting. Although I remember I used to write about APIs and they always had the restaurant metaphor was like the go-to. The waiter is the API in those examples. But it sounds like you are getting a bunch. I mean, I think in your role too, right? It sounds like you're getting an influx of inbound requests for content. Have you ever considered trying to have AI read all the inbound requests and give their opinion on which ones should be pushed forward?
Wow. That's a great idea. But what if those requests are also coming from AI? So suddenly we have this AI to AI communication.
Yeah.
Well, Asher and I were talking about in another episode is like everyone on social media starts using AI to talk for them, and then pretty soon it's just the AIs are talking to each other and nobody's actually real.
Well,
and then social media, that's a real danger.
Well, look at if you use Gmail, for example, but you're using Gmail and it starts doing these little completions that are probably and hopefully trained on your own content.
Yes.
Where's the boundary there, right? If you start writing a message and you just like accept all of the things it suggests for you, is it you? Is it an echo of you? Is it the AI?
We're calling it private.
Well, and LinkedIn does this in chat, right? LinkedIn in chat is very quick to like make suggestions for like, thank you. And usually they're pretty bad suggestions. So I don't feel like we're in any short-term risk of people just communicating through LinkedIn. But
okay, so that's kind of funny because I see those suggestions and I almost always put the other person's name in my reply to make it really clear that I wrote it myself.
I do the same thing.
I do the same thing. You have to signal to your audience that like it is really you, and you have to like stay authentic to it. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly.
Okay, well, this always happens in these podcasts. Is we get towards the end and we're like, oh, we could do yet another podcast from there. So Jeff, if it's okay, we'll bring you on later in the year and get reviews on what's top of mind for you then. But I hope you enjoyed spending time with us.
This has been a total blast. I of all the different ways to interact with audiences, these conversations I think are the best. Certainly there's the real formal way where you create a presentation, you stand up and you talk. Yeah. But in a lot of my recent like live sessions, I'm saying I could do that, but I'd much rather just have a conversation with you and with the audience. Yes,
and it's far more free flowing, Yeah, totally. I mean, we're big believers in that. So thank you so much for spending time with us, and we'll bring you on later on. Again, as we like circle back on different topics and presenters, and best of luck in your journey.
Sounds awesome. Really enjoyed being here.
Thank you for listening to Unlearn. Subscribe wherever you listen and visit unlearnpodcast.com for the transcripts.